So, why would I use this version here over just using a template literal and plugging that value in? And I heard somebody mention it earlier. I know Gavin and Mark talked about it a little bit last week with the template literals. Sorry. SQL injection. Yeah. Little Bobby drop tables. When we just take whatever, like let's say this ID, right now I just have it coded as a variable right there, but eventually we might pull it from the URL, right? We might write something like this, and then the ID is the request.params.id, right? So then, what if somebody, instead of going to character/1, went to characters/semicolon drop tables characters, semicolon, right? Something like that. Now, it wouldn't exactly be like that, but it would be something like that. Thank you, Crystal. And so now this no longer is holding a number like I expected it. It's holding more of a SQL query. So what would end up happening is, right here, you would put a semicolon here to end this query, and then write the rest of a query after it, that the user could just type whatever they wanted after that. That's awful. We don't want that to happen. PG Promise has built into it features that will sanitize the input coming from the user and escape any characters that SQL might find significant as part of a query. And it'll just make them input. It'll put quotes around everything so that it's, you know, that's one way I could help fix the problem would be to put quotes around that, but somebody could still into quote, you know, if they were just inserting something in here, they could write still whatever they wanted. So we're going to trust that PG Promise is going to do a better job of validating this input and escaping it so that somebody can't do SQL injection. So anytime you're taking a value from somewhere and using it in your query, this is why you have something that looks like ID equals ID equals ID or whatever, is because here's the variable name called ID. It just so happens to match this from my database. I can't change this in my code because that's what the database column is called. I could call this other ID here though, like Fooberry. And I'd have to call this one Fooberry. This is ID because that's ID. So if I call this Barberry, then this would have to be Barberry. So hopefully that kind of shows you where each ID is coming from, right? So this is the name of the parameter from the URL where we're going to pull the value from. We're going to assign it to a variable called this. Use that variable here when we do the query. So this action that I just wrote, this is the action to get one character, right? I'm looking for one character with that ID, except this is an array. If I'm getting one character, the one that has the ID, it doesn't make sense, I think, to return an array. I just want to return that one object, right? So how do I do that, right? So the then here. Right? This is what I think John asked about. This then with the data. So the database query here is asynchronous. I wrote this function. The rest of this code, this function, this whole thing is going to end before the database query is done. So what this then does is similar to a callback, right? App.get, and then I give it a callback that'll get called. So when my app loads, all of this code runs. This function gets called whenever someone visits that URL, right? Then this will run, and there's like, this function's over. Except the database is still doing work. So we could use a callback here to this And in the same way, pass a function as a second argument. That's passing a callback function. A lot of times is kind of considered like an older way of doing it. A more modern approach to writing these is to use a new feature of JavaScript called promises. That's what this then function is. Instead of passing a callback to any, what's going to happen later, it returns a promise. And then we give the callback to the then function, and the promise has this. So db.any returns a promise. A promise has a function on it called then, and you give that the callback. Why would you do this over just a callback? Promises can be chained. So you can say then, dot then, dot then, dot then, dot then. And when you write them out in your code, because they're chained, they just go like this. Just dot then, dot then, dot then, dot then. If you are having callbacks, and each callback had to happen after the next thing, instead of then do this, then do this, then do this, I would have callback, 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 and I would be now like 8 functions deep nested in my code. So that's the reason promises were invented, was so that rather than nesting a bunch of callbacks, which trust me, nested callbacks get really hairy and kind of hard to think about. It's a lot easier to read a couple thens chained together. An example of thens being chained together are like when we use fetch, and then we say fetch, and then give it a URL, then we say then parse the JSON, then we have the data. If that was a callback, that would be 3 functions like nested in callbacks, and it's kind of gnarly. So that's where the then comes from. So what happens is the promise, when the promise gets resolved, this function will get called, and the data that came back from the query, that's what's in this variable here, when this function gets called. So, okay. So I'm going to make a couple small syntactical changes here because this is killing me. Cool. I also, as much as I love foo berries and barberries, so does that sort of answer the question of ID is ID is ID?
So what's the fancy local host Postgres thing stand for? I think I missed that.
So I think when you all configured it, you might have given it an object that had a database name and a host and a port. Or maybe just a database name, because that's the default host and port. Yeah, so this is the default host and port. 5432 for Postgres is, unless you change it to something else, that's what it's going to be. And localhost means like the database are running on my computer. I've always configured them using this URL. So this is a Postgres configuration URL. It's got the same information that object that you would pass has in it. You can put a username and a password here. Username, password, at localhost, 432, and then this is the database name. That it's the same thing. Most database things take either what they call a connection string, which is that, or a configuration object, which is an object with the key with the database name and all of that. So I've always liked this because when your configuration object gets more complex, it's a big object with a lot of keys, or you can just have like the values be right there in the string. So it's a personal preference thing. I don't think there's a big difference between them. Okay, so that's ID is ID is ID. Were you good on that? Did that make more sense? Cool. Where's our list? There. It's the bear. ID is ID is ID. What? Setting up PG promise. Let's talk a little bit more about that. Although I kind of pre-checked it. That's okay. We're going to talk about it a little bit more. So I said that this returned an array. But I don't think an array makes sense when we're asking for a character with the idea of 1. And if I change this, whoops, why is it column 1 does not exist? Oh. Okay, I shouldn't have quoted it. Okay. So if I change this to 2, I should get Jake. Cool. So we're actually well on our way to building an API here. But like I said, though, it's an array. I want to just return the object because I'm only ever asking for 1, right? So here, this is what happened. I said db.any. Postgres PG Promise gives you a couple different functions, and the one you use to call the query says, with the results that come back, these are the type of objects you might get, right? So db.any is like, hey, you're going to get an array back as a result. If there's no results, it'll be an empty array, right? If there's 10 results, you'll have an array with 10 things. If you want one thing, right? So here, when I'm doing an insert, I don't expect any results back, right? So I'm going to say db.none, which tells PG Promise, like, hey, I'm not expecting to do anything with the results. Here we go, 1. Right? This is where I get the result back. Oh, it's lagging a little bit. All right. So let's change this to 1. Perfect. No array. Just Jake the dog. Here, just Finn Newman, right? What happens if I do this? Ooh, it's just spinning, and I've got a huge exception. That's not what I think should happen in my app, right? I don't think I should throw a big exception if there's no data, right? So PG Promise has more functions than just 1. It also has, and there's a list of them somewhere. I think they're right here on this page. One, none, right? Where is it? There's a table of them, I thought. So I think it's called 1 or not. Yeah, I thought there was a table that listed them all, but here it is. So any expects anything, same as many or none. If I want 1 or none, expect 1 or 0 rows back. Now I'm going to reload this over here. And instead I just get back null. That's a much better result, I think. I could even get fancy in my response handler and say, if the data was null, send back a 404 message in JSON, right? Like, send back an object with the key error and says, like, no characters found. That would be a nice thing, but I'm happy getting null back from the API rather than a huge exception, right? With a big, now there's no error message in my log from that either. Because I don't think it's unreasonable that somebody might put a wrong number up there, right? I don't want that to be a big explosion in my app just because someone queried the wrong ID number. I think I should handle that as a normal course of business. So that's why I might use 1 or none. So that's basically it with PG Promise. PG Promise is you pick the function to call based on what type of data that you'll expect to get back from the query you're writing. You write that query. If you have any values to interpolate in, you pass them in as an array, and you number them based on their position in that array. Even though arrays in code are 0-based, the API here is to count them as 1-based. So this is the first element. If I was passing 2 things in here, I'd pass the second one here, and I would say $2 somewhere else. If y'all want, I can pull up kind of a big project where I do lots of different stuff with PG Promise, and you can kind of see it in use. I'll come back at that in a minute. So that's sort of setting up and using PG Promise. I think what you all might have been doing with it last week was taking the data and then saying response.render and then giving that data to your template, right? This is just like that, except we're just giving it to response.json and just turning the data directly into JSON and sending it down. So in this app, in this server, there's not going to be any front-end assets. I'm going to set up the front-end assets separately, and then we're gonna make them talk to each other here in a little bit. So let's see where we're at here. We did that. We're going to talk about sessions when we come back from a short break. Let's do 1040. How's that sound?
Yeah.
All right.